Hi everyone, it's William with the Grand Duke Dmitri 1917 Diary Series, and we have some interesting material today about Russia's corps of diplomats in this interim period when there was no stable government. And this will also be the last of the very long diary entry of the 17th of November, 1917. So our recap from last time, Dmitri had a proposal. His commanding officer, General Baratov, had said, look, you could have this position. The first Russian Caucasian Corps was going to go and join the British Army in Mesopotamia and fight alongside the British, and the British government was going to maintain that corps, or I'm sorry, it wasn't a corps, it was a division. The British government was going to maintain that division. You know, it's not on Russian territory, it will be in Mesopotamia, and you could go and be the officer translator or interpreter. You wouldn't have to command anything. And Dmitri found that very appealing, but you know, he had some concerns. He was right to be cautious. You know, even in that setting in Mesopotamia, what would happen if the soldiers' committees decided that he was an inflammatory figure and they didn't want him there? And what would the political ramifications to be for someone who, you know, he hasn't said it yet in his diary, but he will be saying it, for someone who was thinking, I may be the next Russian emperor. So, you know, lots of things to think about. We'll return to that topic. Now we're going on to the diplomats. So here we go. And now on to another topic. It is not without interest to write about what is going on in our diplomatic sphere. It is extremely characteristic of that impasse into which poor Russia has fallen. The fact is that, at the suggestion of Giers, the ambassador to Rome, now seemingly transferred to London, Russia's representatives abroad have decided to conduct their common policy without regard for the government and those in power in Petrograd. In my opinion, nothing will come of this, but at any rate, it is interesting to note. In Teheran, Ether accepted Giers' proposal and put it to a vote in the mission. Apparently, the majority went along with Ether, but they say there were also opponents of this separatist policy. At first, Minersky declared that he was entirely against it and recognized the Caucasus Regional Committee, but then, backpedaling, criticized those who disagree with Giers' proposal, saying that it is necessary now to have only one ideal, the welfare of Russia. I myself am inclined to agree with them, because it is not entirely clear to me how our representatives abroad will make their own policies, albeit under the flag of benefit for the motherland, but without the consent of the voice of those who, though temporarily, are nonetheless in power. Now, as always, I will conclude my entries with a brief description of day-to-day life in chronological order, so that's what we'll be doing next time when we resume with the 8th November 1970. But now let's look at this conclusion of the long diary entry. So who was Giers? He was, as Dmitri correctly says, he was the Russian ambassador to Rome from 1915 to 1917. Dmitri says that apparently he's left from Rome and is in London. You know, presumably he planned to go back to Rome. I don't know about that. I do know that ultimately, in the near future, he would end up being General Pyotr Wrangel's representative to the Allies during the Russian Civil War. Wrangel was a leader in the Russian Civil War, and Giers would become his representative to the Allies, so that makes sense. So yeah, Dmitri is, his reaction is very interesting. So it's interesting that, so this, you know, has been sent, this proposal has been sent to all the Russian embassies and legations. And in the case of Ether, he has decided to tell his staff, let's vote on it. And they voted for it. And Minersky was the Oriental secretary at the Russian legation in Tehran. So he was apparently the main opponent. And for whatever reason, he then went over to the side of the majority. But, Dmitri is still saying, I don't know, this is a good idea. So it seems ambiguous when he says, I myself am inclined to agree with them. It's not clear in that sentence initially who are them, the people who wanted this or the people who didn't want this. But then he goes on to say, because it's not entirely clear to me how our representatives abroad will make their own policies. So, he's not really on board with this. And I'll tell you what, it's smart on his part. I'm not saying they shouldn't have done it. I mean, I think it actually worked out as well as it possibly could have. But Dmitri, looking at this pragmatically, is quite right. So we have this ideal in our diplomatic corps of benefit for the motherland, but who's going to make these policies? And how can they function if there's no stable government? There's no government that's recognized as legitimate by the Allies. Yes, they can represent Russia's well-being in a broad sense, but then, who's going to be directing it? Who's going to be coming up with the policies? Will that be Giers himself, or, it sounds like it's going to end up being fairly chaotic. And that's quite typical of Dmitri, that he likes to take a step back and look at things, in an analytic way, and not let emotion come into it. And that was very much the case, for instance, as you'll see in 1919, before news had come that the Grand Dukes had been killed, Dmitri's father and the others that were with him. His aunt, Dmitri's aunt, Grand Duchess Maria Georgievna, wife of Grand Duke Georgy Mikhailovich, had wanted Dmitri to join her effort to write to President Woodrow Wilson and plead with him to do something for these men who were being held in prison by the Bolsheviks. And Dmitri said no. Surprisingly, I suppose, he told his aunt, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to sign this letter, because then the president is going to think that the Romanovs are just concerned about the Romanovs, instead of being primarily focused on Russia's well-being and what's going to happen to Russia. So you could argue that he was wrong about that, but that was his conviction. He didn't want to give the impression that that the Romanovs were only interested in saving their own hides. Okay, anyway, so this is quite typical of him, his response to this. Yes, this is attractive to think of these pre-revolutionary ambassadors and ministers remaining in place and representing Russia, but how is it going to work? So how did it work? Well, I guess, all right, I guess. I think there were trade agreements between the Bolsheviks and the Allies, like around 1920, 1921, and then the Soviet state was firmly established and recognized by other countries in 1922 at the end of the Civil War. And in that interim, you did have the embassies remaining open. I'm not sure where all the funding came from, and they were very helpful to the emigres in doing things like, getting visas and things like that. So they did very useful work. And in some instances, that work would continue, even when there was a Soviet embassy in London, alongside it, there was a White Russian embassy in London, a Tsarist Russian embassy in London that, again, was very helpful to emigres. Emigres could go there. The head of that, the ambassador there, was Mikhail Sablin, and he helped Dmitri and Maria with documents. He helped other people with documents, and maybe also jobs and things like that. And it was kind of a central location. And that was the only one that I know of that remained in place up through the beginning of the Second World War. I don't know if there were others. It'd be a great topic for a doctoral dissertation if it hasn't already been done. Probably has, but who knows. So another thing that's interesting that I don't want to skip is that Minorski, before he went over to the other side, was saying, well, I recognize the authority of the Caucasus Regional Committee. Since there's no stable government in Moscow or Petrograd, this is who I'm taking my instruction from. And if I'm not mistaken, the Caucasus Regional Committee was led by this man whose name I forget, who was called the sorry, a bit of an interruption there, that will pass hopefully. Who was called the Lenin of the Caucasus. So he was an extremist. But anyway, that was arguably correct to say, since there's no instructions from the center, we're going to focus on the instructions coming from the nearest regional authority. He did change his mind about that. And then this idea of consent and voice. This is Dmitri's. This is not Minorski. He says he can't agree with this because, how are they going to make their own policies without the consent or the voice of those who, though temporarily, are nonetheless in power? So that's what I'm saying with this example about Dmitri and Maria Georgievna. This is the pragmatic, realpolitik kind of man that we have in Dmitri. I may not like them, and I hope they're going to be gone soon, but they are in power. And we cannot legitimately act without their consent and their voice. So very interesting stuff. Apologies for the interruption. I hope that wasn't too distracting. What do we have next time? Well, this diary entry of the 8th of November is going to talk about the hunt. You remember Dmitri was excited because he'd had an invitation to go out with the Swedish gendarmes to another interruption, sorry about that, to go out to the desert and hunt onagers, I think is how you say that. But there will be some complications, so that's what he's going to be talking about next time, and I hope to see you then. Bye.